5 minutes before my ex-husband's life started falling apart. He was standing in the pediatric wing of Riverside Methodist Hospital, holding a diaper bag, and telling anyone within earshot that leaving me had been the smartest decision he'd ever made. I remember the exact time, 10:17 a.m. I know because I looked at the wall clock above the nurse's station when I realized I was actually looking at Mark Reynolds for the first time in nearly a year. Some people say time heals everything. I don't know about that. What I do know is that 12 months after a divorce, you stop expecting certain surprises. You stop expecting to see your ex-husband in the middle of a busy Tuesday morning while you're carrying a tablet full of patient charts and trying to make it to a staff meeting, especially when he's standing beside your former best friend, and especially when she's holding a baby. I froze for half a second. Not because I still loved him. That part was long gone. But because some wounds leave scars, and scars can ache when the weather changes. Welcome back to Ashes of Inheritance, where ordinary women keep their composure while everything around them falls apart and walk away with their dignity intact. If you believe the quietest person at the table is often the one holding the most, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. That morning, Columbus was cold and gray. Rain tapped against the hospital windows. Maybe that explains it. Or maybe seeing the two people who helped destroy your marriage just never feels normal. Dr. Carter. One of the nurses glanced at me. You okay? Yeah. I adjusted the tablet under my arm. Just distracted. The nurse nodded and hurried away. I thought I could walk past them. I really did. Unfortunately, Mark saw me. His face lit up immediately. Not with embarrassment, not with regret, with amusement. The same smug expression I'd spent years looking at across dinner tables. Well, he called out loudly. Look who it is. A few people turned. Hospital waiting rooms have excellent acoustics when you least want them to. Jessica looked up from the baby stroller. Her smile was smaller, more cautious. At least one of them had enough sense to be uncomfortable. I considered continuing toward the elevator. Instead, I stopped. After 20 years in medicine, I'd learned something important. Running from uncomfortable situations rarely makes them disappear. Hello, Mark. He grinned. Emily. The baby in the stroller was reaching for a toy giraffe. Blonde hair, blue eyes. About a year old, maybe a little younger. Jessica adjusted his blanket. The movement felt strangely rehearsed, like she wanted everyone around us to notice how happy her little family looked. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mark broke the silence. How have you been? The question sounded friendly. His tone wasn't. I've been fine. Still working too much. I almost laughed. That accusation again. For years, every disagreement in our marriage somehow circled back to my career. Too many hospital shifts, too many conferences, too many patients. Never mind the fact that he worked 60-hour weeks himself. The rules had always been different for me. I enjoy my work. Oh, I know. A couple sitting nearby exchanged glances. They could sense what this conversation really was. Most people can. Mark took a step closer. I guess some things never change. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Mark, what? He shrugged. We're all adults here. I knew that look. He was performing. Some people don't want an audience. Mark always did. Then he delivered the line, the one he'd probably been waiting a year to say. Leaving you was the best decision I ever made. The waiting room became very quiet. Even the television mounted in the corner seemed less noticeable. Jessica stared at the floor. I kept my expression neutral. Not because I wasn't angry, because I was. But physicians learn emotional control early. You can't panic during emergencies. You can't lose your temper when people are counting on you. And after enough years, that discipline becomes habit. Mark wasn't finished. A useless woman can't have children. There it was, the old knife, the one he loved twisting. For almost 7 years, we had tried to have a family. 7 years of appointments, tests, specialists, disappointment, crying in parking lots, driving home in silence. At least that's how I remembered it. Back then, I'd believed we were suffering together. I didn't know how wrong I was. Jessica squeezed the baby bottle in her hand. Mark, stop. But he was enjoying himself too much. He nodded toward the stroller. I'm lucky. His smile widened. I have a 1-year-old son with your best friend. The words hung in the air. Cruel, deliberate, designed to hurt. The funny thing is, I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt tired. Deeply tired. Maybe because I'd already done my grieving. Maybe because betrayal gets less powerful after enough time passes. Or maybe because I knew something he didn't. Not everything, but enough. I looked at the little boy. None of this was his fault. Then I looked at Jessica. She wouldn't meet my eyes. That surprised me. People who are proud of their choices usually don't stare at the floor. Finally, I looked at Mark. He was waiting for a reaction. Tears, anger, something, anything. Instead, I smiled. Just a small smile. Nothing dramatic, really, I said. His confidence flickered. Only for a second, but I saw it. The same way physicians notice subtle symptoms others miss. What does that mean? He asked. Nothing, I shrugged. Just interesting. Now, he looked irritated. Good. For once, he wasn't controlling the conversation. My phone buzzed inside my lab coat pocket. A text message. I glanced down. The sender's name immediately caught my attention. David Lawson. I hadn't expected to hear from him that morning, especially not there, especially not then. The message contained only 6 words. I'm downstairs. We need to talk. My pulse quickened, not from fear, from surprise, because David wasn't the kind of man who sent urgent texts without reason. And suddenly, I had a feeling this ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but ordinary. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Mark was still staring at me, waiting, trying to figure out why I wasn't upset. For the first time all morning, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The last thing I expected that Tuesday morning was a text from David Lawson. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 3 months. As I stepped away from the waiting area, I could still feel Mark's eyes on my back. He hated unfinished conversations. He always had. For years, he'd followed me from room to room whenever we argued. He needed the final word, needed to feel like he'd won. I pressed the elevator button and waited. The doors opened. Just before they closed again, I heard Mark call after me, still running away. Emily, I looked back. No, Mark. The doors slid shut. I'm finally walking in the right direction. For once, I left him without an answer. The elevator carried me down to the main lobby. Outside, rain streaked across the large glass windows facing Olangi River Road. Patients and visitors hurried through the parking lot, holding umbrellas against the March weather. David was sitting near the hospital coffee shop. Even from a distance, he looked serious. That immediately concerned me. David wasn't dramatic by nature. At 58 years old, he had built a reputation as one of the most respected attorneys in Columbus. People hired David when things became complicated. Very complicated. When he noticed me approaching, he stood. Emily, David. We shook hands. You sounded urgent. He glanced around the lobby. Can we sit? That was never a good sign. We found a quiet corner near the coffee stand. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the scent of disinfectant drifting through the hospital. Normal Tuesday morning sounds surrounded us. Phones ringing. Wheelchairs moving across polished floors. Doctors discussing patient cases. The familiar rhythm of my professional life. David opened a folder. I found something. Immediately my stomach tightened. What kind of something? The kind that changes everything. I leaned back in my chair. A year earlier, David had represented me during my divorce from Mark. At the time, I thought the settlement had been unpleasant but straightforward. Apparently, I was wrong. David slid several documents across the table. Take a look. I scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. My eyebrows lifted. These aren't right. No, they can't be. David nodded. They are. For several seconds, I simply stared. Bank records, investment statements, property disclosures, numbers, lots of numbers, and they told a very different story than the one Mark had presented during our divorce proceedings. How much? I finally asked. David sighed. Based on what we found so far, he paused. Close to $7,000. I blinked. $7,000. Not $7,000. Not $7,000. $7,000. Assets Mark had apparently hidden during the divorce. My first reaction wasn't in anger. Oddly enough, it was disbelief. Mark wasn't a criminal mastermind. He forgot passwords. He lost receipts. He once locked himself out of our own house 3 times in 1 month. Yet somehow he'd managed this. How? David smiled slightly. That's the funny part. Funny. You know how most fraud investigations start. I shook my head. Someone gets greedy. That answer sounded about right. David continued. Mark applied for financing on a commercial property 6 months ago. I frowned. A commercial property. He wanted to invest in a medical office building. I almost laughed. Of course he did. Mark loved appearances. Successful people owned investment properties. Therefore, Mark wanted one too. The problem with lies is that eventually they collide with paperwork. And paperwork never forgets. When he applied, David explained he disclosed assets he never reported during the divorce. Now I understood the same documents that helped him qualify for financing had accidentally exposed him. A mistake. A very expensive mistake. For the first time that morning, I smiled. Not because I felt victorious, because the entire situation was absurd. After all the planning, after all the deception, after all the damage he'd caused, he'd potentially exposed himself trying to buy a building. David chuckled. That reaction is healthier than the one I had. What was yours? I spent 20 minutes yelling at my printer. That actually made me laugh. The first genuine laugh I'd had in days. A nearby visitor glanced over curiously. I lowered my voice. What happens now? David's expression became serious again. We investigate further, and if everything checks out, we petition the court. I nodded slowly. The possibility felt strangely unreal. For a year, I'd focused on moving forward, building my life again, working, healing, trying not to spend too much energy thinking about Mark and Jessica. Now suddenly, the past was walking back into my life. Part of me hated that. Another part couldn't ignore it. There's something else, David said. I looked up. The tone of his voice had changed, and that worried me. What? He hesitated. Emily, I need to ask a question. Okay. When you and Mark were trying to have children, I felt my chest tighten immediately. That subject still carried weight even after everything. What about it? Did he ever complete a full fertility evaluation? The question caught me off guard. I remembered every appointment, every test, every specialist, every difficult conversation. And one memory stood out. Mark always finding reasons not to finish certain examinations, work obligations, travel, scheduling conflicts, excuses. At the time, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. No, I said quietly. He never completed everything. David nodded almost like he'd expected that answer. Why are you asking? He tapped the folder. Then he looked directly at me. Because another document surfaced. A chill ran through me. What kind of document? A medical report. Now my physician instincts immediately collided with my personal emotions. Medical privacy mattered a lot. I had spent my entire career protecting it. David seemed to recognize my concern. I'm not asking you to violate ethics. Good. But I can tell you this. He leaned forward. The report strongly suggests Mark knew something years ago. I didn't speak. Neither did he. The silence lasted several seconds, long enough for my imagination to start connecting dots. Dangerous dots. Finally, I asked the question. Are you telling me he lied? David answered carefully. I'm telling you, there are reasons to believe he knew far more than he admitted. My heartbeat quickened, not because I had proof, because suddenly dozens of old memories felt different. Conversations, arguments, accusations. The way he'd blamed me, the way I'd blamed myself. The years I spent wondering whether my body had failed our marriage. Outside, rain continued tapping against the windows. Inside, something else was beginning. Not revenge, not yet, but truth. And sometimes truth can be far more dangerous. As I stared at the folder between us, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't David. It was a notification from social media. Jessica Miller had just posted a new family photo, and for the first time, I noticed something in that picture that made my stomach drop. Something I should have seen much earlier. I stared at Jessica's photo for several seconds. Then I looked again. Maybe you've had one of those moments. The kind where your brain notices something before you're consciously aware of it. A detail, a tiny inconsistency, something that doesn't fit. The picture showed Jessica sitting on a blanket at Goodale Park with the baby in her lap. The caption read, "Perfect Sunday with my little man." Hundreds of likes, dozens of comments, people congratulating her, calling them a beautiful family. But I wasn't looking at the caption. I wasn't even looking at Jessica. I was looking at the child, specifically his age. 1 year old, maybe 13 months. And suddenly, a timeline that had never quite made sense started clicking into place. I lowered the phone. "What is it?" David asked. I hesitated, then shook my head. "I'm not sure yet." The truth was, I didn't trust my own emotions enough to say it out loud. Not yet. Years in medicine teach you not to jump to conclusions. You gather facts first, then you form opinions. Unfortunately, being human makes that difficult sometimes, especially when your own life is involved. David checked his watch. "I need to get back downtown." I nodded. "And I need to get back to work." He stood. "Just be careful." Careful of what? His expression darkened slightly. People who build their lives on lies don't usually react well when the truth starts showing up. That turned out to be an understatement. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Patient consultations, administrative meetings, endless emails. By 6 o'clock, I was finally driving home through rush hour traffic. The rain had stopped. Downtown Columbus glowed beneath streetlights and wet pavement. Normally, I listened to music during the drive. That evening, I drove in silence. My mind kept returning to the same questions. What exactly had Mark known? How long had he known it? And why did Jessica look so nervous that morning? By the time I reached my townhouse in Upper Arlington, I had no answers, only more questions. The next few weeks became frustrating. David's investigation moved slowly. Court filings, financial reviews, interviews, legal procedures. Nothing dramatic. Real life rarely moves at movie speed. Meanwhile, Mark continued acting like everything was perfectly normal, almost aggressively normal. He posted photos online, family vacations, birthday parties, pictures of the baby, the image of a happy family, the image he'd always wanted people to see. Sometimes I wondered if he actually believed it himself. Then something unexpected happened. On a Thursday afternoon in April, Jessica called me. I nearly ignored it. Actually, I almost laughed when I saw her name. Jessica hadn't contacted me directly in over a year. Not after the divorce, not after moving in with Mark, not after becoming the center of the biggest betrayal of my adult life. Yet there her name was Jessica Miller calling. I answered, "Hello." Silence, then breathing. Nervous breathing. "Emily," I immediately knew something was wrong. Jessica had always talked quickly when she was anxious. Now she sounded like someone preparing for bad news. "What do you want?" A pause. Then, "Can we meet?" I almost said no. Probably should have, but curiosity won. "When today? What more silence? Finally, I need to ask you something." That answer only made me more suspicious. Still, we agreed to meet at a Starbucks near Grandview Heights. An hour later, I walked inside. Jessica was already there. She looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The difference is hard to explain unless you've seen it. As a physician, I'd seen it thousands of times. People carrying burdens they couldn't put down. She stood when I approached. "Thanks for coming." I sat down. "Start talking." Jessica looked around nervously, then lowered her voice. "Have you heard anything about Mark?" There it was. Not an apology, not guilt. Concern. Real concern. "What kind of thing?" Her fingers tightened around a paper coffee cup. "He's been acting strange." I waited. "He keeps taking calls outside." "Okay." "He gets angry whenever I ask questions." "Okay." And she hesitated, then stopped. I studied her face. For the first time, I realized something. Jessica wasn't happy. Not even close. The carefully curated photos online had hidden it well. But sitting across from me now, she looked overwhelmed, scared, almost trapped. "Jessica." My voice softened slightly despite myself. "What aren't you telling me?" She swallowed, then spoke so quietly I almost missed it. "I found paperwork." Immediately my attention sharpened. "What kind of paperwork?" "I don't know." "That's not true." She looked down. "Medical paperwork." My pulse quickened. Suddenly I understood why she'd called. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was looking for answers. Answers she thought I might have. Unfortunately, I didn't. Not yet. "What did it say?" "I don't know." That answer sounded genuine this time. I only saw part of it. She rubbed her forehead. But Mark freaked out when I asked about it. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she asked the question she'd clearly been building toward. "Emily?" I looked up. "Did he ever lie to you?" The irony nearly made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. This woman had helped destroy my marriage. And now she was sitting across from me, asking whether the man she'd chosen could be trusted. Life has a strange sense of humor. "Jessica," I stood. "That's a question you're going to have to answer yourself." She looked disappointed, maybe even hurt. But I wasn't the person who owed her emotional support. Not anymore. As I walked toward the door, she called after me. "Emily." I stopped. "What?" Her face had gone pale. "I think something's wrong." I looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "So do I." 3 days later, David called, and what he told me changed everything. Not because it confirmed my suspicions, because it shattered them. The truth was far stranger than anything I had imagined. And 5 minutes after that phone call, a very familiar baby bottle hit the floor of Riverside Methodist Hospital. 3 days after my meeting with Jessica, I was reviewing patient reports in my office when David Lawson called. The moment I heard his voice, I knew this wasn't a routine update, Emily. He said, "You need to sit down." I leaned back in my chair. "I'm already sitting." "Good." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it felt longer. Then he delivered the news. "The financial investigation is moving forward." I nodded. That wasn't surprising. "What else?" David exhaled. "We've confirmed that Mark knowingly concealed assets during the divorce." My eyes closed briefly. Even though I'd expected it, hearing confirmation felt different. Real, permanent. "You sound like there's more." "There is." I heard papers shifting on his desk. "Emily, are you alone?" "Yes." "Good." Another pause. Then the medical records issue became connected to a separate legal matter. Immediately my stomach tightened. What legal matter? A paternity dispute. For a second I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. A what? A paternity dispute? I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the employee parking lot. The sky above Columbus was clear for the first time all week. Cars moved slowly along Alongi River Road. Normal life continued outside. Inside my office, everything had suddenly become very abnormal. "What are you saying?" David lowered his voice. "The child." My heart began pounding. "The child isn't Mark's biological son." I said nothing. couldn't. My mind was trying to process the sentence, not because it was impossible, because it was unexpected. All this time, I had assumed Mark had gotten exactly what he wanted. The family, the baby, the life he claimed I couldn't give him. Now suddenly, that foundation didn't exist. Jessica knows. Not yet. I stared out the window. You're sure? As sure as anyone can be before formal proceedings begin. I slowly sat back down. For years, I'd imagined various forms of justice. None of them looked like this. None of them involved Mark becoming the victim of his own deception. And yet somehow that felt fitting. The man who spent years blaming others was finally running out of people to blame. What happens now? I asked. That's complicated. Meaning, David sighed. Meaning things are about to become very public. He wasn't wrong. 2 weeks later, everything exploded. The trigger was surprisingly ordinary. A court notice, one document, one filing, one legal action. That's all it took. People imagined scandals arriving like earthquakes. Usually they arrive like paperwork. By Friday morning, Mark was calling everyone he knew, friends, former co-workers, relatives, anyone who might help. By Friday afternoon, nobody wanted to answer. The story was spreading. Questions were spreading faster. And then came the moment that finally broke him. The hearing. Franklin County Courthouse, downtown Columbus, room 5B. The place was packed, far more crowded than I expected. Apparently, nothing attracts attention, quite like a respected businessman, discovering that several versions of his life story cannot all be true at the same time. I arrived early. Old habit. Doctors and courtrooms both punish lateness. David was already there, organized as always. 3 binders, 2 legal pads, a cup of black coffee. He looked up when I entered. You ready? No. He smiled. Good answer. Why? Because people who enjoy days like this usually have problems. That was fair. I wasn't enjoying it. I was nervous. Not because I feared the outcome, because public exposure carries a cost. Even when you win, especially when people you once loved are involved. At 9:03 a.m., Mark entered. For the first time in years, he looked genuinely uncertain. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the smile. Jessica followed several steps behind him. She looked exhausted. Neither of them appeared to have slept much. I almost felt sympathy, almost. The hearing began. The judge moved quickly through procedural matters. Then came testimony, documents, evidence, records, months of investigation condensed into a few hours. The financial fraud allegations came first. Hidden accounts, undisclosed investments, false statements. Each document chipped away at the version of reality Mark had spent years constructing. Then came the part that changed the room. The fertility records. The silence was immediate, absolute. Even the attorneys stopped shuffling papers. Everyone listened. The evidence revealed that years earlier during our marriage, Mark had received information indicating severe fertility problems. Information he never shared, information he concealed, information that allowed him to continue blaming me. The courtroom remained silent. I sat perfectly still. Not because I wasn't emotional, because I was more emotional than I expected. For years I'd carried that burden quietly. The self-doubt, the guilt, the questions. Now strangers were learning the truth in less than 10 minutes. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to laugh. Mostly I felt relieved. Finally. The truth existed outside my own memory. Then came the final revelation. The paternity findings. The judge reviewed the report. Attorneys spoke. Arguments were made. Facts were presented. When it ended, there was no confusion, no misunderstanding, no alternate interpretation. The child was not biologically related to Mark. The room erupted into whispers. I glanced toward Jessica. Tears streamed down her face. Oddly enough, she looked just as shocked as everyone else. Maybe David had been right. Maybe she truly hadn't known. Mark sat motionless like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. The strange thing was that I didn't feel victorious. Not exactly. I felt free. There is a difference. Victory depends on someone losing. Freedom doesn't. The judge's final ruling came shortly before lunch. Financial penalties, additional proceedings, asset redistribution, consequences, real consequences, not revenge, accountability. And for the first time in years, those two things felt very different. As people filed out of the courtroom, several former friends avoided eye contact with Mark. Others simply walked away. His audience was gone. His performance was over. The truth had finally taken center stage, and there was still one final chapter left to write. 6 months after the hearing, I was sitting on my back patio with a cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. The sun was setting over Columbus. A warm October evening, the kind Ohio gets right before winter starts, reminding everyone who's in charge. I set my coffee down and checked the screen. It was a text from one of the younger physicians I mentored. "Thank you for helping me through residency. Couldn't have done it without you." I smiled. Of all the messages I'd received that year, those meant the most. Not the legal updates, not the gossip, not the endless questions from people suddenly interested in what had happened. The meaningful messages came from people moving forward with their lives, because that's what I was finally doing too. The months following the hearing had been surprisingly quiet, at least for me. Work kept me busy. In June, I accepted a new position as Chief Medical Officer for a growing healthcare network, serving several communities across Central Ohio. The role came with longer hours, more responsibility, more meetings than any reasonable person should ever attend. But I loved it. For the first time in years, I felt completely focused on my future instead of recovering from my past. Every morning, I drove to work without carrying old resentment with me. That alone felt like a victory. Not everyone was doing as well. Mark's legal problems continued. Additional investigations uncovered more financial irregularities. Nothing dramatic, just the slow, steady consequences that follow years of bad decisions. The courts handled the rest. I stopped paying attention, not because I didn't care, because it was no longer my responsibility. That may have been the biggest lesson of all. At some point, you have to stop carrying other people's mistakes, even when those mistakes hurt you, especially then. Jessica contacted me once during the summer. I almost didn't respond, but curiosity got the better of me. We met for lunch at a small cafe in Dublin. The meeting was uncomfortable. Not hostile, just uncomfortable. Some damage doesn't disappear because enough time passes. She arrived early. I arrived cautious. For several minutes, we talked about ordinary things: weather, work, traffic. Neither of us wanted to discuss the obvious. Finally, she did. "I'm sorry." The words landed softly, not dramatically. Not like something from television. Just two simple words from someone who looked genuinely exhausted. "I said nothing," she continued. "I know that doesn't fix anything." "No, it doesn't." She nodded. "I know." For the first time since we'd sat down, she looked directly at me. I believed things that weren't true. I studied her expression. There was regret there. Real regret. Not self-pity, not excuses, just regret. The older I get, the more I appreciate the difference. We talked for another hour, not as friends. That chapter was over, but as two people who had survived the same liar in different ways. When lunch ended, we hugged briefly, awkwardly. Then we went our separate ways. That was enough. Forgiveness is a complicated word. People talk about it as if it's a single decision. It isn't. Sometimes forgiveness simply means deciding not to let anger occupy space in your life anymore. That's where I landed. Not friendship, not reconciliation, peace. And honestly, peace turned out to be much more valuable. One Saturday afternoon in September, I was organizing old boxes in my garage when I found something unexpected. An old photo album. The kind people made before every memory lived on a phone. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages. Pictures from medical school, family vacations, birthday parties, my first apartment, my wedding, the early years of my marriage. For a few minutes, I studied those photographs. Not with sadness, not with bitterness, with perspective. The woman in those pictures wasn't weak. She wasn't foolish. She wasn't a failure. She was simply trusting. Sometimes trust gets rewarded. Sometimes it gets exploited. Either way, trusting isn't the mistake. Betrayal is. That realization brought me more comfort than I expected. Because for years, I'd quietly wondered what I could have done differently. The answer was simple. Nothing. At least nothing that would have changed another person's character. People make their own choices. Mark made his. Jessica made hers. Eventually, those choices created consequences neither of them expected. The same is true for all of us, good or bad. Sooner or later, what we build is what we live inside. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the trees, I carried the photo album back into the house. My life wasn't perfect. Nobody's is. I still had difficult days, stressful weeks, moments when old memories appeared unexpectedly. But those memories no longer controlled the direction of my life, and that made all the difference. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that truth moves slowly, but it keeps moving. You may not see results immediately, and justice rarely arrives on your schedule. Still, what is real has a way of surviving. If this story reminded you of someone you've known or something you've overcome, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on how far you've come. Sometimes looking back helps us appreciate the life we're building today.